The story begins the only way it can, by ripping the curtain back immediately. Imagine tomorrow your name trending worldwide for all the wrong reasons. That's exactly what William Wallace faced in 1305. His execution wasn't just about ending a life. It was about advertising the price of disobedience in the bloodiest way the medieval imagination could conjure. Think you could stomach medieval justice? Spoiler, most modern people would faint before the real show even starts. So, before we start, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and the local time where you are. I always love seeing the spread of night owls and insomniacs who tune in. As the room softens around you, lean back and allow this story to unfold, an experience unlike anything you've listened to until now. Because behind the phrase, drawn and quartered, lies a reality so chilling, it makes today's horror movies feel like children's cartoons. The crowd gathers in a London square, pressing shoulder to shoulder, eager for a show. Vendors hawk hot pies and ale as if they're at a football match, not a death sentence. A man, filthy from weeks of imprisonment, is dragged forward. He knows what comes next, and yet the public doesn't shrink away. They lean in, hungry for spectacle. The gallows stand tall, but they're only the start. The condemned isn't just going to die. He's about to be transformed into a warning, a message carved quite literally into human flesh. Executions in medieval Europe were never just about killing someone. If authorities wanted that, a sword stroke or a noose could do the job quickly. But rulers understood something disturbingly modern. People remember images more than words. Drawing and quartering was spectacle engineering at its peak. Pain, performance, and politics all bound together. Historians still argue whether the purpose was deterrence or sadism disguised as law, but the truth is probably both. It begins with being drawn, the prisoner tied to a wooden hurdle, dragged by horse through filthy streets. Imagine the humiliation, people spitting, jeering, children tossing rotten food. It's not enough to strip away freedom. They strip away dignity too. Then the hanging, but not to death. Not yet. The trick was to stop short, cutting the victim down while still alive. Here's where many accounts falter, with different chroniclers contradicting each other, partly because witnesses were too horrified to look steadily. Some records suggest victims often lost consciousness, sparing them the worst awareness. Others insist they were revived with cold water or slaps, forced back into the nightmare. By now, the crowd is buzzing. People jostle for a position, hoping to glimpse details they'll later retell in taverns. Every ruler knew fear spreads faster than parchment proclamations. A citizen who saw such a scene would recount it for decades, ensuring the king's warning traveled further than any knight could ride. The disemboweling comes next. It's described politely in court records, but everyone knew the raw reality. And here's a quirky tidbit. There are rare mentions of victims making defiant jokes even during this stage. One Frenchman reportedly shouted insults at his executioner mid-torture, as if humor could puncture horror. It didn't save him, but centuries later his bravado is remembered more than the king who ordered it. After that came the quartering. The body severed into 4 parts, dispatched to corners of the kingdom like grisly postcards from hell. Heads might be mounted on city gates. In London, the infamous London Bridge became less an architectural marvel and more a grotesque trophy rack. Tourists today admire its stonework, forgetting it once doubled as a billboard for royal cruelty. This wasn't random barbarity, it was calculated governance. Monarchs needed to remind subjects who was in charge. Today, governments put up surveillance cameras. Back then, they put up body parts. Different technology, same underlying message: obey or be watched or be destroyed. Even the church often endorsed the ritual. Clerics blessed the execution, framing it as divine justice. A sin against the crown doubled as a sin against God. Scholars still debate whether commoners truly believed these killings kept society safe or whether they simply played along out of terror. Either way, the message seeped deep. Rebellion is not just futile, it is annihilation. One can almost smell the mix. Sweat of the crowd, stink of ale, smoke from torches, and something more metallic that lingers once flesh is cut. People went home shaken, yet satisfied, whispering the condemned's name as though it were already a ghost story. And the victim. He disappeared into fragments, part man, part myth, part warning pinned like a grotesque flag over a frightened land. The stage of spectacle ends not with silence, but with chatter. the gruesome echo of hundreds retelling the scene, each detail exaggerated, each shiver passed along like currency. The execution is over, but the story has only begun, because behind the mechanics of pain lies a darker truth. This system didn't evolve overnight. It was deliberately invented, codified, and nurtured by kings who found cruelty far more effective than mercy. And so the question lingers, whispering across centuries. Who exactly dreamed up this masterpiece of horror, and why was it judged not only acceptable but necessary? The origin of this ritualized brutality is not some accident of mob violence, but the deliberate invention of a state determined to keep its subjects in line. England during the high medieval period had a legal system obsessed with hierarchy and order, and nowhere was that obsession more visible than in the punishments handed out for treason. Killing a king or conspiring to overthrow him was considered not just a crime, but the ultimate blasphemy against the natural order. The response had to be more than death. It had to be theater, terror, and theology all tangled together. The law spelled it out clearly. Treason demanded the harshest punishment imaginable, and drawn, hanged, and quartered became the formula. It sounds almost like a nursery rhyme when said quickly, but the reality was state-approved sadism. Each step carefully chosen for symbolism. Being drawn to the scaffold symbolized being torn away from loyalty. The hanging teased death but denied the dignity of a swift end. The disemboweling mocked the idea of inner virtue by spilling it in public. Finally, quartering shattered the body as proof that rebellion shattered society itself. The authorities didn't just kill traitors, they turned them into metaphors. Historians still argue whether this originated under Henry III or was codified more firmly under Edward I. What's certain is that by the late 13th century, the practice was law, etched into the fabric of English governance. Edward I, the same king who crushed Welsh rebellions and battled the Scots, is often credited with making the ritual a political performance. If a ruler's power is measured by his ability to scare everyone else into submission, Edward achieved it with medieval flair. And it wasn't only men. Though rarer, women accused of treason could face equally creative penalties. The official logic? Public decency. Yes, the same authorities who thought slicing a man into quarters was wholesome worried about modesty when it came to women. So female traitors were sometimes burned instead, the idea being that flames spared the public from seeing their bodies mutilated, a twisted notion of respect, but it illustrates how the law bent morality in whatever direction suited its purpose. A quirky detail lost in many retellings. Sometimes the condemned had to pay for parts of their own execution. The hurdle, the ropes, even the knives, all might be charged back to the estate. Imagine dying by a method so elaborate it bankrupted your family. A joke going around taverns back then might have been, "Better not commit treason unless you want your children to inherit a bill." Dark humor is the only kind that survives in such times. One case in the 14th century underscores just how calculated this punishment was. Hugh Despenser the Younger, a favorite of Edward II, fell from grace and became the poster child for what could happen when political alliances soured. His execution in 1326 was spectacularly cruel, even by contemporary standards. Chroniclers detail the crowds cheering as he endured the full ritual, with every symbolic step exaggerated to hammer home the point. Betrayal of the crown leads to obliteration. His remains were scattered far and wide, a grim postal service of loyalty reminders. The entire process reveals a strange contradiction. On one hand, medieval English law was obsessed with written codes, precedents, and procedure. On the other hand, the enforcement of that law depended on raw, unfiltered brutality. The courtroom and the chopping block weren't separate worlds. They were chapters of the same story. One offered the illusion of reason, the other the reality of force. Why England specifically? Other European kingdoms had their gruesome punishments, but drawing and quartering became peculiarly English, a national brand of terror. Some scholars suggest the island's geography played a role. Unlike continental Europe, England didn't have the same shifting patchwork of borders. Rebellion meant challenging a relatively centralized authority. That authority, in turn, relied more heavily on making examples. One rebellion crushed in London could be enough to frighten Wales or Scotland. Sending body parts across the country was cheaper than stationing garrisons in every village. Efficiency masquerading as cruelty. And let's not forget the crowd. The legal invention worked only because people showed up. Rulers needed an audience, otherwise the warning fell silent. There are records of town criers announcing executions days in advance, drumming up anticipation. It was civic duty dressed as entertainment. Imagine the medieval equivalent of push notifications. Traitor execution this Thursday at noon. Don't miss the spectacle. Historians still debate how the common folk felt about all this. Did they truly believe justice was being served, or did they merely fear missing out on the one big event of the week? Some chroniclers claim people went home trembling, vowing obedience. Others hint that executions became twisted social gatherings where neighbors mingled and children treated them like carnivals. The truth, as usual, probably lies between horror and habit. By the 15th century, the punishment was so entrenched that questioning it meant questioning the very authority of the crown. Monarchs relied on ritual cruelty, not only to punish individuals, but to broadcast stability in times of political crisis. When rebels rose, when dynasties wavered, when foreign threats loomed, nothing steadied a throne like the sight of a body literally torn into messages. But here's the chilling part. What starts as a legal innovation can, over time, become tradition, even accepted normality. And once cruelty is normalized, it takes centuries to dismantle it. Drawing and quartering would outlast medieval kings, creeping well into the early modern era before anyone dared to suggest it was too much. The invention had succeeded all too well, and as the practice spread, so did its victims, some famous, some forgotten. Each body became another chapter in a macabre chronicle of obedience, which begs the next question. Who were the people who actually endured it, whose names echo down the centuries while their screams dissolved in the air? The victims are the ones who keep this punishment from drifting into abstraction. Laws and monarchs can feel remote, but names like William Wallace force it all into sharp, uncomfortable focus. His story, romanticized by Hollywood with blue face paint and soaring speeches, had a far grimmer ending than any movie dared to show. In 1305, Wallace was captured and brought to London. The trial was a formality, the verdict preordained. What mattered wasn't whether he lived or died, but how much spectacle his death could generate. Dragged through the streets, he was jeered at by a population already primed to despise him. Chroniclers note that even the horses struggled to pull him over the cobblestones, a detail that, ironically, makes the scene even more humiliating. Once at the gallows, Wallace endured the full choreography of drawing and quartering. His head ended up on London Bridge, while his limbs were scattered to the four winds: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. The king ensured that wherever Scots might gather, a grisly reminder of England's dominance would be waiting. But Wallace is just the celebrity case. Countless others face the same fate without ballads to immortalize them. Take Dafydd ap Gruffydd, the last independent Prince of Wales. Captured in 1283, he was the very first recorded victim of the punishment in English history. His death marked not only the end of a rebellion, but the beginning of a terrifying precedent. Symbolically, it told the Welsh people that even their prince could be reduced to fragments. Talk about psychological warfare packaged as law. Then there's Hugh Despenser the Younger, whose 1326 execution bordered on performance art in its cruelty. He had been hated as much for personal arrogance as for political betrayal. Accounts describe his death as excessively prolonged, with the crowd almost reveling in the humiliation of someone who had once lorded power over them. A chilling reminder that even elite status offered no insulation once a monarch turned against you. Quirkier stories also emerge, where victims managed flashes of defiance. Sir Thomas Armstrong, executed in 1684 for alleged involvement in the Rye House plot, reportedly scorned his accusers right up to the scaffold. Some accounts even suggest he offered a sarcastic bow to the crowd, as though he were starring in a play he never auditioned for. Historians still argue whether these anecdotes are genuine memories or later inventions to give doomed men a shred of dignity. But the very persistence of such tales shows how audiences craved more than gore. They wanted narrative, heroes and villains, drama threaded through agony. Not every victim was a noble rebel. Commoners, too, occasionally found themselves subjected to the ordeal, especially during moments of political paranoia. A peasant accused of plotting against a lord, or a soldier who deserted in wartime, might find himself condemned in the same manner as high-born conspirators. This universality, anyone could, in theory, be torn apart, helped cement the punishment's power. Fear works best when it is indiscriminate. One fringe tidbit: some chroniclers whispered the dogs sometimes fought over discarded scraps near execution sites. Officials might toss bits of tissue into the Thames, and scavenging animals did the rest. It's grotesque, yes, but it reveals just how normalized this horror was. When executions become routine enough that even strays learn to expect leftovers, you know cruelty has fully blended into daily life. What fascinates scholars today is how different groups remembered these victims. For the Crown, they were cautionary tales, proof that treason never paid. For rebels, they became martyrs, their broken bodies symbols of resistance. Wallace, Defid, and countless others lived on in stories long after their physical remains were scattered. There's irony here. The very act meant to erase their power only ensured their names would echo longer. The punishment destroyed flesh but unintentionally preserved memory. Crowds, meanwhile, told their own versions. A villager who traveled miles to witness an execution might recount the details for years afterward, each retelling embellished like folklore. Was the victim brave or pathetic? Did the executioner fumble his blade? Did a limb twitch unnaturally, proving he suffered longer than expected? These were the medieval equivalents of post-game analysis, where horror mixed with entertainment. Historians still debate how often victims actually survived through multiple stages of the ritual. Some argue most lost consciousness early, their suffering exaggerated by spectators' imaginations. Others insist certain executions were deliberately drawn out to maximize agony. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Variability depended on the skill, or sadism, of the executioner. In any case, the uncertainty kept the terror alive. People could never be sure just how bad it would be, which made the threat even more powerful. By the 17th century, the list of victims expanded to include men caught in the whirlwinds of political and religious upheaval. Catholics accused of plotting against Protestant monarchs, or Protestants under Catholic rule, found themselves quartered in the same ritual. Treason was a flexible label, stretched to fit whatever rebellion most threatened the crown at the moment. For those condemned, the punishment was final proof that politics, religion, and cruelty had merged into one. Picture the legacy: bridges lined with heads, gates decorated with limbs, villages whispering names long after the bodies were gone. Each victim added to the collective archive of terror, but behind the spectacle was always a practical core. The execution only mattered because people gathered, watched, and remembered, which leads to the unsettling truth. Without an audience, the performance of cruelty loses its power, and that opens the door to an even stranger question. If death itself was theater, what role did the crowd really play? Spectators, accomplices, or victims in their own way? The punishment was nothing without its audience. A king might order a man drawn and quartered, but unless thousands of eyes witnessed it, the message would fall flat. That's why executions were scheduled like festivals, announced days in advance, and staged in central squares. The crowd wasn't an afterthought, it was the entire point. People streamed in from villages, turning a death sentence into a day trip. Mothers carried children on their shoulders, vendors sold roasted chestnuts and pies, and the air smelled like both celebration and dread. Some chroniclers describe jugglers and musicians warming up crowds before the condemned even arrived. Entertainment and terror braided together until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. Historians still argue whether these crowds came out of fear of missing official justice or out of sheer appetite for drama. Either way, the scene was packed every time. Commerce thrived on this ritual. Tavern keepers loved execution days. Extra ale barrels tapped, extra coins in the till. Merchants sold ribbons or tokens supposedly tied to the condemned's fate. Some swore such charms could bring luck, while others claimed they warded off treasonous thoughts. Fringe tidbit: there are scattered reports of people scrambling to dip cloth in a traitor's blood, believing it had mystical potency. It was grisly entrepreneurship, but no stranger than today's obsession with celebrity memorabilia. The crowd's psychology was equally twisted. Watching someone torn apart provided both reassurance and catharsis. Reassurance because the spectacle showed the crown in control. Catharsis because ordinary frustrations could be vented in shouts at the condemned. The execution became a pressure valve for a society seething with inequality and unrest. Instead of rebelling, people screamed at a bound man and went home feeling purged. Cruel, yes, but undeniably effective social engineering. London Bridge itself became a stage beyond compare. Heads of traitors preserved in tar glared down at everyone crossing. Travelers arriving in the capital didn't just see commerce and grandeur. They saw the crown's warning spelled in human remains. Some heads reportedly stayed there for decades, weathering like grotesque gargoyles. Imagine your morning commute passing beneath the shriveled faces of executed men, each one a silent message. Don't get ideas. The economic role of execution culture extended even further. Pamphlets and broadsides were printed recounting famous deaths, sold on the streets like souvenirs. These publications blended fact, rumor, and outright fiction. Sometimes they cast the condemned as villains, sometimes as heroes, depending on political leanings. Either way, they turned human suffering into marketable content. In other words, medieval true crime podcasts, just with fewer microphones and a lot more bloodstains. And then there's the uncomfortable complicity of the people themselves. The authorities depended on spectators, but the spectators weren't passive. They cheered, jeered, sometimes demanded more. Executioners who bungled their work could be pelted with stones or mocked as incompetents. The crowd expected quality in their horror. Like customers at a restaurant, a botched cut wasn't just sloppy, it spoiled the entertainment. If cruelty was theater, then executioners were actors performing to the harshest critics imaginable. Children were not spared from this civic education. Parents deliberately brought them, believing it built character and loyalty. One 16th century commentator noted approvingly that the youth learn obedience by sight of justice. Modern psychologists might call that trauma bonding. The laughter of a child eating a pie while watching a man's life disintegrate is one of those details you'd wish were fiction, yet it happened often enough to be recorded. Still, not everyone applauded. There are scattered reports of onlookers fainting, weeping, or even vomiting. Historians still debate whether these reactions were rare exceptions or common undercurrents. Some suggest many attendees went not out of joy, but out of fear of being absent. To ignore the king's justice might look suspicious after all. In that sense, even the crowd was under surveillance. Show up, cheer loudly, and prove your loyalty. Control worked both ways. Monarchs used executions to intimidate, but the people used them too, subtly. A crowd could turn the death of a rebel into martyrdom by murmuring sympathy, or by telling the story afterward in ways that made the condemned seem noble. That's how legends sprouted, not from parchment records, but from tavern whispers and bedtime tales. Wallace, Despenser, Armstrong, all were kept alive by the same crowds meant to erase them. There's irony here. The more the authorities tried to terrify the population, the more they risked turning the condemned into folk heroes. It's like a feedback loop of cruelty and resistance. The king demanded obedience through fear, but fear sparked stories that sometimes glorified defiance. The punishment depended on the audience, yet the audience could never be fully controlled. As the centuries wore on, this contradiction sharpened. Execution days became bigger, the crowds larger, the commerce more lucrative. But the stories spun around these spectacles were slipping out of the crown's grip. You can scatter a body, but you can't scatter memory. And memory had a habit of curdling into myth, which leaves the looming question, when the last screams faded and the last heads rotted away, what legacy did this ritual of horror really leave behind? By the time the 18th century rolled around, England had changed in countless ways. New monarchs, new wars, even new colonies spreading across oceans. But one constant still clung to the heart of the kingdom, the ritual of drawing and quartering. It lingered like a stubborn shadow, repeated with all the weight of tradition. The punishment had begun as an invention of control, expanded into a performance of politics, and flourished as popular entertainment. Yet in its final centuries, it transformed again into a cultural memory that refused to die. The final victims of the practice lived in a world already shifting toward modernity. They were not medieval rebels with swords, but men caught in webs of conspiracies and plots against a government that now wielded muskets, newspapers, and bureaucrats. In 1782, David Thierry, convicted of espionage for passing naval secrets to the French, was hanged, drawn, and quartered, the last man in Britain to endure the full ritual. Eyewitnesses noted that even then, crowds gathered in Portsmouth with a mix of anticipation and unease. People still came for the show, but whispers of disgust ran louder than they had in centuries past. It was as if society finally realized it had outgrown its own nightmare. Still, echoes of the punishment reverberated far beyond the scaffold. Even after quartering disappeared, the sentence lingered in legal records well into the 19th century. Convicted traitors might technically be sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, though in practice the courts reduced the punishment to hanging alone. The language survived because tradition dies slowly, and lawmakers seemed reluctant to erase the specter of ultimate terror. Scholars still argue whether this legal hangover was symbolic bluster or a deliberate reminder of the state's theoretical power. Either way, it shows how a culture of cruelty can embed itself so deeply that it outlives its own practice. The legacy isn't just in law, it's in language. Even today, people toss around the phrase, "I'll be drawn and quartered," as a figure of speech, usually to describe being criticized or scolded. Imagine the irony. What was once the most excruciating punishment known to man now survives as a casual exaggeration in office gossip. Humanity has an odd talent for trivializing its darkest inventions, turning horror into idiom. But the memory of drawing and quartering also haunts cultural imagination in subtler ways. Literature of the 19th century often returned to it, sometimes as macabre detail, sometimes as metaphor. Charles Dickens, always keen to highlight the grotesqueries of English justice, referenced the punishment with both horror and disdain. Playwrights and novelists drew on it to illustrate the dangers of tyranny. In doing so, they preserved the memory, even as the practice itself slipped into the past. And then there are the images. Paintings, woodcuts, and later engravings ensured that future generations didn't have to imagine blindly. Artists rendered every stage, the dragging through the streets, the gallows, the quartering itself. These weren't sensationalized inventions, but sober records presented almost clinically. One of the strangest legacies of this punishment is that some of the earliest graphic manuals of violence we possess are official depictions of state cruelty. If you've ever wondered how humans first normalized horror through mass media, here's your answer. It began with woodcuts pinned to tavern walls. The punishment also left behind a more intangible inheritance, the uneasy debates it sparked about human cruelty. Even in the 16th and 17th centuries, there were critics who muttered that quartering was excessive, unnecessary, unbecoming of a civilized kingdom. By the Enlightenment, these voices grew louder, armed with new philosophies of reason and rights. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria argued that justice should deter without degrading, punish without brutality. Yet it still took decades for the English state to let go. Tradition had such a grip that only a cultural revolution of values could pry it loose. Historians still debate whether quartering was more effective as deterrent or as propaganda. Did it really stop people from committing treason, or did it simply feed the crown's appetite for dominance? Evidence is thin. Rebellions and plots continued even after the grisliest executions. If anything, martyr stories suggest that the practice backfired, turning traitors into legends, ensuring their deaths carried symbolic weight far beyond their lives. Wallace became Scotland's eternal freedom fighter, Dafydd ap Gruffydd Wales' tragic prince, Armstrong the defiant conspirator. Perhaps the punishment succeeded less in deterring crime than in cementing resistance narratives. What's undeniable is that it shaped English identity in paradoxical ways. On one side, it broadcast strength, the monarchy as an unchallengeable institution. On the other, it revealed insecurity, a government so terrified of rebellion that it needed to dismember bodies to feel safe. That duality, powerful yet anxious, commanding yet fearful, runs through English history, from the Plantagenets to the Tudors to the Hanoverians. Every head on a spike was both a victory and an admission of vulnerability. The remnants of quartering survive not only in Britain, but in how modern societies wrestle with punishment. The echoes appear whenever debates flare up about capital punishment, torture, or making examples of wrongdoers. Humanity has abandoned the quartering block, but the impulse behind it, using violence to scare others into obedience, still lurks in policy rooms and headlines. Whether it's televised trials, maximum security prisons, or shock and awe military campaigns, the logic is eerily familiar. Deterrence through spectacle. Different tools, same psychology. Fringe details linger too. For instance, London Bridge, once adorned with rotting heads, became a romantic landmark. Tourists pose for photos there now, sipping lattes, oblivious that centuries ago the same stonework reeked of tarred flesh. Ghost stories cling to the place, with legends of decapitated figures haunting its arches. Scholars may dismiss them as folklore, but the persistence of such tales proves that cultural memory doesn't fade easily. A city never quite scrubs away the stains of its past. And what about the common people who once crowded for the show? Their role in the legacy is equally complicated. On one hand, they were accomplices cheering cruelty. On the other, they were victims too. Conditioned by fear, manipulated into believing obedience required bloodshed. Today we ask whether modern audiences, glued to violent films and true crime podcasts, are really so different. The forms of spectacle evolve, but the fascination with watching others suffer hasn't gone away. Maybe humanity never outgrew the execution square, it just swapped it for screens. By the 19th century, abolitionists and reformers finally dismantled the ritual. It wasn't mercy that killed quartering so much as embarrassment. A society that prided itself on reason, commerce, and empire could no longer justify theatrics that looked like barbarism. England wanted to present itself as enlightened. Public torture didn't fit the brand, but erasing the practice didn't erase its memory. The stories of Wallace, Daffod, Despenser, Armstrong, and Thierry still circulate, proof that bodies can be quartered, but history cannot. In the end, the legacy of drawing and quartering isn't only horror, it's also a mirror reflecting how far societies will go to protect power, how cruelty becomes normalized when wrapped in ritual, and how people always, eventually, look back in disbelief at what they once accepted as normal. It's a reminder that progress isn't linear. It's a series of shocks, realizations, and reckonings. And as the final heads rotted away, the silence they left behind was deafening. People began to wonder, had they really believed for centuries that mutilating bodies was justice? Or had they been swept along by fear, ritual, and spectacle, mistaking cruelty for order? That question remains unanswered, echoing still every time we debate the boundaries of punishment today. The punishment is gone, but the ghost lingers. Perhaps it always will. The images fade now. The clamor of the crowd drifts away. The torches dim, and the iron clank of shackles softens into silence. What once seemed unbearable to watch dissolves into the distance of centuries. The horror has been told, the story unfurled, and yet it rests now as nothing more than memory. The mind can take a breath. The bodies that once lined bridges and gates are gone, returned to dust. The fear that shook entire kingdoms has ebbed, replaced by the slow rhythms of a quieter world. Where once children were brought to watch a man torn apart, now children stroll across the same bridges licking ice cream cones. Time has a strange mercy. Cruelty becomes history, and history becomes whisper. As you sit in the softness of this moment, the weight of the tale recedes. Breathing slows. The past stays where it belongs. Not forgotten, but transformed into lesson. You can let go of the images, knowing they no longer hold power over you. The screams have vanished, only your steady pulse remains. And so the night closes gently. Shadows lengthen. The world falls still, and the darkness feels less threatening now, more like a blanket drawn across the day. Rest can follow, and with it, the calm assurance that the worst cruelties of history are not your burden to carry. Another story will come, of course. It always does. But for tonight, the scaffold is empty, the square is quiet, and the silence is yours. Next time, perhaps, we'll step into the mysteries of a forgotten palace or the secrets of a vanished civilization.